right, I'd like to welcome you all here tonight. My name is Bernard Hakel. I chair the Public Lectures Committee, which organizes these events. And today's event is a Stafford Little Lecture Series. The Stafford Little Lecture Series was founded in 1899 with a gift of $10,000 by Henry Stafford Little, class of 1844. For over a century, the Public Lectures Committee has directed that the Stafford Little Lecture Series address topics in, quote, the general area of the social sciences, unquote. Past Stafford Little lecturers have included Theodore Roosevelt, Albert Einstein, Thurgood Marshall, and Gunnar Myrdal. Recent Stafford Little lecturers have included Linda Greenhouse, Jill Lepore, David Brooks, and David Kahneman. Our speaker today will be introduced by Princeton's Professor Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor. Without further ado.
All right, I'm just gonna sit here. So thanks everyone for coming out. Tonight I want to especially thank the folks from Princeton University's Public Lecture Series. My name is Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor. I'm an assistant professor of African American Studies. I am the author of 2 books, one From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation, and 2, How We Get Free, Black Feminism and the Combahee River Collective. And so I am very happy to be able to briefly introduce Michelle Alexander and allow us plenty of time to get into the business at hand. So Michelle Alexander is a highly acclaimed civil rights lawyer, social justice advocate, legal scholar, and visiting professor at Union Theological Seminary. Her 2010 book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness, argues that the U.S. criminal justice system functions as a system of racial control, even as it formally adheres to the principles of colorblindness. The New Jim Crow, a New York Times best-selling book, received numerous awards, including the NAACP Image Award for Outstanding Nonfiction and the National Council on Crime and Delinquency Prevention for a Safer Society. So without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Michelle Alexander.
Hi.
All right, so let's just get into it. I'm pretty excited about, I don't know if excited is the right word. I'm looking forward to actually being able to talk about what is happening right now. So the last time we did one of these conversations was in Chicago. It was May last year. And at that point, it was 6 months into the Trump administration. And so now it's been, a little bit over a year. It's similar, like on the year anniversary, there were these mega women's marches and lots of reflection about what the last year's been like. So what's the last year been like? What do you think?
Yeah, well, we've all been trying to survive it in a lot of ways. And, we were talking before we officially got started here. And I was reflecting on my growing sense that resistance is not enough in these times. And I think we're seeing fairly clearly that more is required of us than simply reacting to every bad and evil thing that Trump and his administration does. And so for me anyway, the question is, what is required of us now? If it isn't simply reacting and resisting the evil, what then? And my own view is that in these times, we are going to have to carve out more space for thinking very seriously about what we want instead of Trump. And I don't mean just another Democrat. And
Yes.
yeah. And it's difficult to have conversations about what we really want and what kind of world we want to make possible, what kind of democracy we truly aim to co-create, what type of justice system would actually be just when we're dealing with the onslaught of the Trump administration and the manic behavior of our commander-in-chief. But I believe that if we fail to do that, if we fail to carve out some time to think very carefully about what we want to create instead, we may find ourselves in a situation a few years from now where we manage to elect some Democrats, maybe even take control of the House, maybe win back the presidency. But we will not have actually defeated Trumpism. We will not have defeated the mindset and the racial politics that brought us to this moment in time. And so rather than just reacting, although we do need to react and we do need to resist, I hope we'll spend more time in the months and years to come thinking more carefully about what kind of democracy we want and what kind of justice system we aim to create and begin building and fighting for what we actually want rather than just resisting an unwanted reality.
I think about that. I was at a school called Randolph-Macon last week, and I was giving a talk on a talk that was like from Black Lives Matter to the white power presidency, and talking about the dynamics of race and class. And it was one of the things that I brought up was for those among us who are just waiting to get back to the good old days when Barack Obama was president, or when the Democrats, early on in his presidency controlled the Congress, can really only do so by ignoring many of the conditions that gave birth to the Black Lives Matter movement in the first place, right? That didn't come from Mars. It didn't, come from the Bush administration, although there were certainly the seeds of it created there, but that this was really a movement that developed in part because of the ways that expectations were raised by the candidacy of Barack Obama, and then dashed, with the death, the sort of continuity in state violence, whether that was the murder of Oscar Grant on the subway platform in Oakland on New Year's Day in 2009, before Barack Obama had even been inaugurated, or whether it was Barack Obama, I described it as hiding in the White House when Troy Davis, who was on death row in Georgia, was facing pending execution. And you have black students literally marching all around Washington, D.C., demanding that the black president that they helped elect actually come out and say something. And so it's easy to forget all of that in the sort of boorishness and just insanity of the Trump administration. But I think that what you're saying in terms of it can't just be what we're against, but we have to actually talk about what it is that we want, has to be a central part of that discussion. And so I would ask you, what are your thoughts about that? Like, what if we took the discussion out of, well, here's all the horrible things that Trump does, and we need to, see an end to that. But if we were actually in a position to put forward the demands of what it is that we actually want, what would some of that look like?
Well, first I want to go back for a minute, because the point you just made about Barack Obama's presidency and the raised expectations and the fact that, you know, the movement for Black lives were actually born under his administration as a result of the growing frustration with the contradictions between having a Black president and yet a system that tolerates, you know, the violence, police violence, state violence against Black people to go unaccounted for. I think before we can define with great clarity what it is we want, we do have to face the past. We do have to tell the truth about how we got to this moment in time. And I think in that connection about mass deportation today. And, you know, the media today treats these deportation stories and the stories of ICE showing up and ripping people away from their homes or places of work as though this began with the Trump administration. And of course it did not. People have been deported, separated from their families in cruel and devastating ways now for decades in the United States. And mass deportation escalated dramatically under the Obama administration, much in the same way that mass incarceration escalated during the Clinton administration. And we have to be honest about that and recognize that the same kinds of racial and political dynamics that gave birth to mass incarceration are now giving birth to mass deportation. And it's our failure to confront meaningfully the system of mass incarceration in its infancy that we now even have a private prison system that can profit off of the detention and deportation of immigrants today. And it's the same sort of divide and conquer strategies that were used by the Reagan administration, the Nixon administration, and eventually by the Clinton administration of demonizing you know, Black folks and appealing to poor and working class whites and appealing to that get tough impulse on them that helped to birth mass incarceration at a time when Black people were beginning to compete for the first time on equal terms for limited jobs with, you know, white folks, and there was this fear in white communities about what that meant on the heels of the civil rights movement. This whole group of people were now a threat to white racial hierarchies. And that same dynamic is playing itself out again, this time in the context of, you know, fear-mongering and scapegoating of Mexican immigrants. And I hope that as we look forward and begin to define what it is that we want, that we'll see the necessity of connecting the dots between the movements to end mass incarceration and the movements to end mass deportation, and recognize that ultimately both of these crises and both of these movements are rooted in, you know, that question of who is American, whose lives matter, who's disposable in our political and economic systems. And so I would hope for, as we're thinking about what kind of democracy we want, what kind of economy we want, that we prioritize a democracy in which poor people of all colors, no matter who you are, where you came from, or what you may have done, will be afforded basic human rights, including the right to work, the right to a quality education, the right to universal health care, the right to decent housing, the right to work at a living wage, and to be free from the oppressive tactics of a police state that is invested in, to the tune of billions in, in fact, the drug war, we've spent more than $1 trillion investing in the drug war since it began, that we invest in the communities that have been harmed the most by slavery, by Jim Crow, by mass incarceration, by the successive mass deportations that this country has engaged in since its founding.
So, at a place like this, at a school like this, students are often grappling with the idea of what they can do to change things. And, it's often sort of couched in terms of this or that, what public policy can we pursue? I want to be an elected official. This idea that there are systemic issues, but that there's a way in which we can engage with the political institutions and processes that are available to change some of this. And every time I hear you talk about these issues, and in my own thinking, you search for a really long time to find, is there a point in the history where you can actually look to as a point in time where these sorts of, this kind of oppression or exploitation didn't exist? And that's very difficult to do. And so then we're kind of left with the question of, are those types of changes possible in the current existing forms of governance that we have now? And if not, then what is it that we're actually talking about in terms of the types of change that is necessary, that isn't about switching out this candidate for that candidate, but both of whom really believe much of the same thing, but is really about, Martin Luther King towards the end of his life, the Martin Luther King that no one talks about, who talked about the need for a radical revolution of values in this country, and I think that we would say beyond. And so what does all that mean for people who were searching out what does change look like, and what does it mean?
Well, I guess this is kind of a version of the reform or revolution question, and my own views on this have changed dramatically, over the years. And, as I indicate in the beginning of my book, I started out very much a reformer, very much tinkering with the machine, very much imagining that another lawsuit, another meeting with the mayor or the right elected official would eventually do the trick, that with enough piecemeal policy reform, we would eventually get to the promised land, that we were on the right path, we just had a long way to go, and it was just going to take a while for us to get there, one lawsuit at a time, one reform battle at a time. I no longer believe that. I no longer believe that our current two-party, pay-to-play political system will ever, as constructed, do justice for poor people and people of color in this country. I don't believe it will. Nor do I believe that a global economic system in which capital is free to cross borders overnight. Factories can close down, move overseas, but people cannot. And where our government feels no responsibility to provide quality education or universal health care or guarantee work for those who are left behind in Detroit or Newark or wherever. That kind of economic system is not ever going to do justice for poor people and people of color. And so we are left with this conundrum that we have a political system and an economic system that isn't actually designed to serve the least advantaged or to ever do right by them. But how do we function effectively given that reality. We can't close our eyes to the fact that we have Trump as a president and that we do in fact have a two-party system and that we do in fact have elections that are coming up that are going to impact the lives of millions of people. And yet we must live with this knowledge that the system is never actually going to deliver justice to those who've been viewed as disposable. My own view is that many reform battles are worth waging, but the question is how we wage those battles, not whether we wage them. So for example, those who are organizing, formerly incarcerated people who are organizing today to ban the box on employment applications and admissions applications to universities like Princeton, those who are organizing for those kinds of reforms are engaging in important and meaningful work, but what we say about that work matters. If we say, if only we ban the box on employment applications, then people who are formerly incarcerated will have a fair chance at employment. No, they will not.
Right.
No, they will not. So we're not going to lie about that. We will consistently say that we need a just economic system. We can openly support socialist alternatives that are employed and used and embraced in other Western democracies, while at the same time fighting for reforms that will make a difference for people who are struggling to get a job today in the current economic environment. I think it's important, though, that we not lie or sell these reforms as though they will actually fix the system, but instead tell the truth that these reforms are necessary given the injustice of the prevailing system. I believe everyone has a right to work. It's not just that you have the right to get an interview without having a box on an application, but everyone, no matter who you are, where you come from, what you may have done, has the right to make a meaningful contribution to their community and to receive as compensation a fair wage so that they can support them and their families. Banning the box will not give us that economy, but we can fight for those kinds of reforms while at the same time telling the truth about and fighting for the eventual birth of the kind of economy and political system that we want and need.
So are you a socialist?
Well, it's funny. I have a hard time calling myself a socialist because I am easily annoyed by other socialists. I have found that many socialists view class as the primary and most salient issue of throughout history, let's put it that way. So to view everything through the lens of class and to minimize at every opportunity the influence of race or gender or sexual identity or to not adequately account for the experience of indigenous communities and cultures. And that tendency, in my experience with my socialist friends, for everything to be reduced to class is very frustrating and annoying and makes me not want to call myself a socialist. But at the same time, books like the one you just published, How We Get Free, that describes the Combahee River Collective's Black feminist statement on the path to liberation, is a wonderful example of the ways in which socialism can be embraced and incorporated into racial justice struggles, into feminist movements, approached in an intersectional way. I haven't had the privilege of being in many communities in which that kind of intersectional socialism that places race and gender at the center and not at the margins is alive and well. And therefore, I have been reluctant to call myself a socialist. But I think it's undeniable that many countries, like Trump's favorite country, Norway, that have adopted, approaches to things like healthcare that have been labeled socialist are far ahead of us. And I have a socialist orientation to many of the most pressing economic questions of our time.
Good. So you asked me this beforehand. We talked a little bit about this, hope. And right now, in the midst of all of that which is chaotic in this country, and the way that that chaos then radiates beyond the borders of this country, what gives you hope right now? Mm-hmm.
I would say a few things give me hope right now. And by hope, I don't mean a expectation that in the next few years, suddenly things will turn around in a way that is promising. What I mean by hope is a sustaining faith that the work and struggles we are engaged in will allow us to evolve morally and spiritually, as well as politically, in the long run. And the young people who stood up on the streets of Ferguson and helped to awaken our nation and the world give me hope. The way in which that movement spread and was embraced in so many communities gives me hope. The organizing and activism of people in prison today, as well as formerly incarcerated people, gives me hope. The activism and courage that's being demonstrated not only on college campuses, but among high school students today, not just the Parkland students, but high school students all over this country who have been increasingly emboldened and active and vocal since Trump was elected in particular, give me a lot of hope. And I'm encouraged by the fact that so many faith communities are now beginning to reckon with their complicity and their silence in the eras of mass incarceration and mass deportation, and beginning to organize and find their voice in this time. All of those things lead me to believe that we are going to grow and evolve as a people. I can't predict the future, but I believe out of all of this, there will be new forms of organizing and activism, new movements, and new possibilities imagined for what our democracy can be and what we can birth together.
I'm interested in your own, how you come to this, right? So we were saying, you were saying beforehand, we met with some students earlier. Michelle met with some students earlier. And, you were talking about your shift from the university as a law professor, as a practicing lawyer, to you're now visiting faculty at Union Theological Seminary. And so I'm wondering if you could just say something about that route, because in some ways, especially when you were talking earlier about really looking at the parallels with the war on drugs and the war on immigrants, if you will, now, that in some ways it screams for more legal advocates, more constitutional scholars, more people who understand the law and can, be advocates for poor and working class people who face these circumstances. And yet you have gotten out of that particular practice and are now in seminary. And so I'm wondering if you could just say something about that movement.
Yeah, well, it's been an interesting journey. As I mentioned, I started off as a liberal civil rights lawyer tinkering with the machine, and my experience trying to achieve change through legal avenues, through litigation, through lobbying, through media advocacy, through campaigning, has helped me to see, as I mentioned earlier, the limits of change that's possible given the political and economic realities, the political system that we have, the economic system that we have. And when I was traveling speaking about my book after it was first released, and I was speaking to anyone who would listen, I mean, in half-empty church basements in the beginning to, everywhere. But I went through a period of nearly 3 years of a nonstop campaign for people to pay attention to the crisis of mass incarceration, and spoke in prisons, spoke in juvenile detention centers, spoke in countless churches, spoke at universities. And finally, when the message began to catch on, and instead of half-empty church basements, suddenly there were hundreds or even thousands of people showing up to hear the message. I had this odd experience where I would step to the podium and give my speech, and as I was walking away, I would hear this voice coming to me that would say, "All sound and fury and signifying nothing." And and it was demoralizing and depressing, and I would just walk off the stage thinking, why does this thought just keep coming to me, all sound and fury and signifying nothing? And it was haunting me, and I was invited to go speak at the Iliff School of Theology in Denver by Dr. Vincent Harding, who actually wrote the speech Beyond Vietnam that Martin Luther King Jr. delivered in 1968, where he called for a revolution of values. And Vincent Harding invited me to speak at the Iliff School of Theology and listen to me deliver my new Jim Crow speech. And at the end of it, he pulled me aside and, in his way, speaking very low and slowly, said, "I appreciate everything you said, my sister. But I think the real message that you're trying to communicate here is what you do unto the least of these, my brethren, you do unto me." That's the message. That's what you're really trying to say. And something broke open in me. And I am not a Christian. I was not raised in a Christian household. I was raised in a household where we welcomed spirit into our homes and honored Jesus as a teacher and great prophet. But we recognized that other faiths had truths to teach as well. And so I wasn't someone who thought of myself as particularly religious, but those words resonated with me, and I realized, yes, that actually is the core truth of what I'm trying to communicate. When Jesus said, "What you do unto the least of these, you do unto me," that is the deep truth. That is a deep truth at the core of mass incarceration, of the core of mass deportation, of the core of rape that occurs in prison and we turn a blind eye to. It is at the core of hunger in the world. It is at the core of every racial, social justice, economic issue, this idea that every life matters, and matters so deeply and so profoundly that Jesus would say, "What you do unto the least of these, you've done unto me." And that got me thinking about the direction of my own work and whether simply railing against political and legal systems was enough. and whether part of what was really required was a moral and spiritual awakening as well, not instead of political organizing and advocacy, but rather as a part of that work, that if we are unable to awaken to the dignity and value of each and every one of us, for real, these systems of racial and social control will just continue to be born over and over again in the United States and around the world. And we have to find a way to infuse our political and legal advocacy with I would say, the moral conviction that, for me, came to be lacking in many of the civil rights circles that I was working in, where civil rights advocacy became playing politics.
Right.
And civil rights lawyers and advocates were no longer those who were really in solidarity with the people who were most harmed, right, the least of these, but were political players in a game they could not win. And so I decided to come to Union Theological Seminary because it has a history of being a space that supports radical social justice organizing and advocacy, and it's the home of James Cone, who is the father of Black liberation theology, but it's also a place that supports womanist theology and queer theology, and is very open to reimagining what kinds of economic systems are consistent with our deepest moral and spiritual values. So it felt like a place where I could begin to ask and be in community with others the kinds of questions that I'm most concerned about right now.
I wonder if through that experience, because you just talked about it being a space that is open to these different theological expressions. And so I think that there's a lot of cynicism that exists today about the possibilities of solidarity. Some of that comes out in a very, I think about the Mark Lilla writings about identity politics, which not only betray a certain kind of ignorance about identity politics and the ways that oppressed people come to politics and radicalize, which is based on their experiences within a particular identity, but also how that then has becomes a source of activism for people. But then I think that there are others who sincerely are trying to figure out how do we overcome the things that separate us, that in some instances are preyed upon. And so the worst of that, I think you can see with the Trump administration, that consciously tries to stoke racial hatred as a way, for whatever the reason is, that there's a way in which that is directly antagonized to separate people. And so I think the lesser version of that exists among groups of people who recognize that there are issues that may connect us or may not, but that there's an understanding, if we are going to be able to overcome all of the many issues that we've talked about and haven't talked about, that there is going to have to be some coming together on some of these things. And I think that there is deep cynicism, even among people who want to do the right thing, about the possibilities of that. And so I wonder what you think about the potential of solidarity, and whether or not you've seen or experienced anything at Union that may give you hope about its possibility.
Well, first, I believe all politics are identity politics. You know, the notion that we engage in political behavior in a way that is somehow divorced from our own identity and personal experience, I think is nonsense. All politics are identity politics. We all have our identities, our life experiences, our lens through which we view the world, and we come to political spaces because of those experiences, and our identities inevitably inform how we relate in those spaces. And so I tend to resent this idea that when Black people or Latinos or queers or whoever, are engaging in politics, that they're engaging in identity politics, while white people, when they engage in politics, that's just politics.
Real politics.
Right. So,
Yeah.
White supremacy is identity politics.
Writ large. Yeah.
Yes, writ large. So, in terms of whether I am cynical about the opportunities for us to find common ground, I would say that I wouldn't say cynicism, but I'm realistic about the challenges that we face in doing so. And I am not someone who believes that the answer is simply for us all to hold hands together and join in a common movement today for economic justice without actually facing and reconciling and attempting to repair, the harms of the past. I don't think that we can, in any relationship, as a nation, we are all in relationship with one another. And in order to move forward in any kind of relationship, you cannot ignore or deny the harms, the abuse, the suffering that has been inflicted in the past. You must first deal with the past openly and honestly in a way that makes it possible for there to be genuine trust in the relationship moving forward. And as a nation, we have refused consistently to acknowledge the truth about slavery, the truth about Jim Crow, or to make any even attempt at reparation. And I'm not a big fan of reparations in the form of just a check that's cut to individuals, because I think that lets white folks off way too easily. You can't just write a check and move on. We're gonna, as a nation, have to really face the harm that's been done and to think very carefully about what it will take to repair it to the extent it's possible. And so much of the harm that has been done by slavery and Jim Crow and mass incarceration is irreparable. But what can we do to repair harm that's being experienced today as a result of those systems and the practices of mass incarceration and mass deportation today? To have an honest conversation about what's necessary to repair harm as a necessary prerequisite to moving forward, I think is important. And as long as those, including my socialist friends, want to avoid the question of how to repair harm that's been done, I think we're gonna have difficulties moving forward. And I think it will also make it easy for those who want to play divide and conquer politics to peel off, the white working class as well as white middle and upper classes from those that might otherwise be in solidarity with them, as long as this idea that we have to get beyond race continues to hold in not only conservative circles, but in mainstream Democratic ones as well as on the left, which is why I think Ta-Nehisi Coates was not wrong to take Bernie Sanders to task for the way in which he dismissively rejected the idea of reparations. It's difficult to trust your partners as true allies if they aren't willing to take seriously the necessity of remedying harm that has been experienced by your own community. So I believe it's possible for us to rebirth this nation, but we're going to have to do it by being honest about the past and learning to center each other's experience and pain. And that is also true, I would say, for African American communities. You know, being willing to center the experience of immigrants, of Muslims, of people who are targets right now of extreme repression, to be able to center that experience as you are also working for your own liberation and for your own communities as well. That's something we're going to need to learn to do. Derek Bell, who was one of my favorite legal scholars, you know, famously argued that racism is permanent in this country. And I'm not sure he's wrong about that. I believe, though, that we do have the power to rebirth this nation. And if we imagine the work that we're engaged in is not simply a matter of building political alliances that will win the next election, but building the kinds of movements that will repair harm that has been done and will reimagine what this democracy can be, I think we have a chance of making this land that we call America, that was stolen from Native people, a place that truly honors us all.
That's great. Okay, slightly different question. The new Jim Crow was published in 2010. Is that right? Why do you think it's still so popular?
Well, mass incarceration isn't over, so you know, in many respects, the dynamics, the political dynamics that were described in the book as having given rise to mass incarceration are playing out today as we speak, and so I think in many ways the book is more relevant today than it was in 2010 when most people still imagined that we are entering into a post-racial America. So I think that's why, mass incarceration isn't over, police killings have not stopped, and the racial politics that birthed mass incarceration have birthed mass deportation and have given us a president that embodies what those reactionary politics look like.
What are you reading right now?
I'm reading your book. I'm reading your book right now, How We Get Free. I'm in the middle of it. I was reading it on the plane, and it's excellent. I encourage everyone to go out and get How We Get Free. Come by your River Collective statement about. It's a fantastic book about.
Thank you.
Intersectional Black feminism and how it was birthed and its relevance for today.
Thank you. Are you reading anything else?
Yeah, I am always reading about 12 books at the same time. I'm also reading a book right now, actually rereading it. I had gotten halfway and hadn't finished it, and I've gone back, called The Next American Revolution by Grace Lee Boggs, which is an excellent book that I highly recommend as well. It's one that argues, and I am not finished with it yet, so don't want to misstate the thesis, but it argues that the kind of movement that is necessary to face our current challenges is going to be unlike any other movement this nation or the world has ever seen.
Right, that's the truth. Okay. All right, so we have time for a few questions. And I think there are people circulating with microphones. Is there someone in the back with a hand? Yeah.
So thank you, ma'am, for stopping by today. So I have a bit of a question. I think there's a comment in the middle of it. So when you talked earlier about how the limitations of the justice system and the civil rights movement and all that, the part of the reason it was so successful, I mean, I feel it was successful was the fact that, African Americans were told, well, there's a justice system and you can depend on that, and that will give us what we're fighting for. But then within the past year and a half, it's like things we thought were the law, that you cannot lie to Congress, you cannot say, I forgot, and just walk away, like Sessions did a couple of times. You can't fill out a form and, not get in trouble for it. But it just, emoluments clause, like things we thought were so fundamental, First Amendment rights, Fourth Amendment right, privacy. But it seems like the more money that pumps into society and technology, like, those things were just, yesterday. And this kind of leads to the question. So the question really is, when we talk about reparations and what can be repaired, what about the idea that, if you walk on Nassau Street right here, you find this DARE campaign, and when DARE was around, how it hurt a lot of black kids, and resulted in mass incarceration. How about going back and looking at those cases like President Obama was trying to do, and say, okay, well, right now we're not punishing people anymore because of marijuana possession. Commute the sentence. And then how all this other idea that happened here on this campus. I'm not affiliated with the university, but I was around when the Justice League did their protest.
Can you get to your, just for the sake of
sure,
other people being
I apologize.
able to
So how about the
participate?
idea? How about the idea also of the fact that, increase admission for black students? If you wanna fix what you did 100 years ago under Woodrow Wilson when he didn't allow black kids, give more black kids admission.
Okay.
I'm sorry, did you get that question? What was it?
I don't. Are there any additional hands?
I had trouble hearing.
Yeah, I did too. Can you stand up, please?
Oh, yeah, of course. All right, I'll try to be concise. What is your opinion on prison abolition, which I believe this is a position advocated by Angela Davis, also very, very renowned African-American feminist, black liberation activist, also affiliated with the Communist Party of the United States. Yeah, essentially, what is your position on prison abolition? Should we just do away with prisons altogether and deal with the root causes of criminality in our socioeconomic system?
I would say that I consider myself a prison abolitionist in the sense that I believe prisons as we know them as sites of the intentional infliction of cruelty and suffering and humiliation should be abolished. Prisons as we know them should not exist. I believe that one day I hope and pray, one day we will look back and view this practice of putting human beings in literal cages, sometimes solitary confinement for years or decades, as horrific as slavery. How could we do something like that to a human being? We treat dogs in the pound better than we treat many human beings who are locked up in cages today. At the same time, I think we have to acknowledge that there are people who have to be removed from society sometimes. And if we fail to acknowledge that reality, I think we are denying the dignity and basic human rights of people who have been victimized by violence or sexual abuse and other types of crimes where they are at risk if the person is free to return to their home or to cause them harm. People who have suffered from domestic violence and who live in fear that they will be harmed or terrorized and who call the police and they do nothing. How have a right to say, I should be safe, and this person needs to be removed from the community because they are terrorizing me or my family. So some people need to be removed, but that doesn't mean that we put them in cages and treat them as less than human and create no pathway for them to re-enter society and strip them of all human and civil rights upon their return. No, it means that we have to reimagine what justice looks like. And there's a, you know, in Norway, again, Trump's favorite country, prisons look so different there than how they look in the United States. You're almost tempted not to call them prisons. They are prisons. And I think there is room to reimagine even what Norway is doing. But consider the fact that the largest prison in Norway, the Bastøy prison, is located on an island that's a nature preserve, where people are not locked in cages, but instead tend to animals, plant gardens, take classes. The goal is for people to reconnect with their own humanity, to learn to care for other living things, including the earth and one another, and be able to return to society capable of contributing to their communities. Most prisons in Norway are small and located close to their families, so that people will be able to remain in contact with their children and have close relationships with their partners or the people they're married to, with the goal of ensuring that when that person is released, that they are capable of supporting their families and their communities in a meaningful way. And so I'm not advocating necessarily that we just copy what Norway has done. I'm saying that there are countries that are so much further ahead than we are in thinking about what justice can be. And I definitely consider myself a prison abolitionist in the sense that I hope that one day the kinds of punishments that we inflict on people no longer exist.
Hi, so my question, I grew up in London and I've lived here for almost 20 years. And when I first moved here, the thing that struck me the most was the complacency. And I couldn't understand why more people weren't more furious at having a government that doesn't seem to actually give a crap about the people in this country. And it was shocking to me to move here from, and I do consider myself a socialist, and I think I'm one of the better ones, but I hope so. So what do you think it is about Trump that has finally mobilized people and motivated people? Is it just that he's so utterly obnoxious that his identity politics reach so many people? Or why are we suddenly seeing this when we haven't really seen this sort of advocacy and activism before?
Well, that's not true.
Well, yeah, I would say that, and Kianga just kind of whispered this as well, that it's not actually true that we haven't ever seen this kind of organizing and advocacy before. Before Trump was elected, there were, courageous movements. The movement for Black Lives burst onto the scene in the era of the Obama administration. Occupy Wall Street predated Trump. There are so many movements that have been courageous and bold before Trump was ever elected. I do agree with you that Trump has revealed something about this nation to us that we had been unwilling to see and unwilling to face. And, Trump is the ugly American, right? He is the manifestation of kind of the underbelly of American political life that we haven't wanted to really face or acknowledge in this country. And so now we see it. We can't avoid it. You know, we see it in our news feed every morning when we wake up. There's no running from it. There's no escaping it. And it's a horror, but it's also a gift because we have the opportunity now to see what we had wanted to deny in the past and to begin to ask some very difficult questions about what we are willing to do in response. And I've been thrilled by so much of the organizing and the activism that's happened over the last year. And I hope that, you know, as in the months and years to come, as I mentioned at the outset, that we move beyond just thinking about how best to resist and fight the Trump administration to thinking much more carefully and courageously and creatively about what we want to create for our democracy instead.
I have down in front. Yep. Well, can we get the student here first and then?
Thank you. And my question was that I know that you mentioned a lot about
Speak into the mic.
Okay, sorry. Can you guys hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So my question is that you mentioned a lot about being honest about our history, and I'm sure as you have watched in the news that many people are now protesting for statues of Confederate generals to be taken down in the South. Do you think that that is a way to basically be honest and deal with our history? And if not, how do you believe it is best to deal and be honest with our history and to find reparations for what has been done to, especially to people of color in general? Thank you.
Yes, thanks for that question. I believe those statues, those Confederate statues, must come down. And you know, what it means to face our history is to say those are not our heroes. Part of rebirthing this nation is to take down the statues of those that were once revered, you know, that represent a nation that we are not willing to embrace. So I think that's part of the rebirthing process. Taking down statues of the Confederacy and putting up statutes honoring the heroes of the new nation we are collectively birthing together. We need new heroes, and that's not an avoidance of our history, it's a recognition of our history, and it's a facing of it squarely that, you know, inspires us to tear down some statutes and to erect some new ones.
Right here.
Good evening and thank you. New Jersey just marked the one-year anniversary of some major criminal justice reforms where we moved our bail system from a resource-based system to a risk-based system. So we're watching that unfold. And today, this afternoon, in honor of the passage of the 15th Amendment, I just read that the New Jersey State Senate introduced a bill that would not only restore the right to vote for people on probation or parole, but to people who are actually incarcerated. And I wondered if you would comment. I wonder if you would comment on the role that being able to vote plays in addressing some of these larger issues that you've spoken of.
Yes.
Thank you.
That's an outstanding victory, and you know, every person should have the right to vote in this country, whether you're in prison, on probation, or parole, or have never been arrested. You should have a voice in this democracy, and I would argue that, you know, those who have been subject to the coercive power of the state have a particular interest in being able to have a voice in how those rules and laws actually operate and whether they should exist at all. So I'm thrilled by those voting rights victories. In other Western democracies, People in prison have the right to vote, not so much in the United States. Felon disenfranchisement is virtually unheard of in other Western democracies. It exists here in the United States because of the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow. Felon disenfranchisement, like poll taxes and literacy tests, were part and parcel of the efforts to disenfranchise African Americans following the Civil War. So it's an enormous victory and one that should absolutely be celebrated. What's going on right now with risk assessment and bail, I think, is an excellent example of how tricky and challenging reform battles prove to be. Because some of what is being proposed, and I'm not talking necessarily about New Jersey, because New Jersey has now abandoned the cash bail system for the most part and has one of the more progressive systems in the nation. But one of the risks in abandoning cash bail is that these risk assessment tools that they're now developing, these high-tech risk assessment tools that they are developing, may prove to be as or more discriminatory than the cash bail system, depending on what criteria is used for calculating the risk of flight or of reoffending. And we also see in reform efforts today, private prisons now in the business of developing these GPS tracking devices and getting in on, trying to cash in on the alternatives to incarceration movements so that they can profit off of long-term home surveillance, the GPS tracking devices that are slapped on people, and an alternative to doing jail time. And I think anyone would likely say, I would rather have a GPS tracking device on my ankle than be in jail. But on the other hand, the goal ultimately is to radically reduce the number of people who have any kind of contact with the criminal justice system, not simply switch people from literal cages to virtual ones where they have high-tech tracking devices attached to them at all times. So I hope that we will stay very alert and attentive as the alternatives to bail or the alternatives to incarceration where efforts are made to try to co-opt those reforms in ways that prove nearly as harmful as the original thing, where the cure winds up being nearly as bad as the disease.
In the back.
Hi, thank you. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how an institution like Princeton could better use its resources to support movements for justice, like the movements you've talked about tonight?
How the institution itself?
The institution or the people who are a part of that institution.
Well, as I see it, the students at the institution are the ones that are most likely to make a meaningful contribution to movements for social, racial, and economic justice. That students are the ones who historically have demanded things like Black studies and feminist studies and demanded that the kind of curriculum be created that would make it possible for them to educate themselves about the crises of the day and respond meaningfully and critically to the challenges of our time. And so I would hope that students today would be asking themselves whether this institution provides courses and faculty and spaces and support for the kind of studies and conversations that are necessary in order to respond meaningfully to the crises of our time. And I don't know enough about Princeton to be able to evaluate whether or not that's the case, but if we imagine, I don't expect the change to happen from the top down in Princeton or really anywhere else. I expect students to be the agents of change in institutions like this and to be able to define what kind of education they want and need, what kind of resources and support they want and need in order to do the work that's required on and off this campus for justice today. I'm encouraged by the rising level of activism on campuses, and I believe that institutions themselves need to be challenged in order to make space for the kind of critical and creative thought and dialogue that is a prerequisite to effective and strategic action.
Right here.
Hi, my name is Taylor Pearson, and I'm a senior in the Woodrow Wilson School with an African American Studies minor. And first, I'd like to say that there's 3 overflow rooms of people who adore you, who aren't able to get in here, and know that this is like exacerbated by dozens. So my question is as Professor Taylor mentioned, it's been 10 years since the new Jim Crow was published, but it's still extremely relevant today. And recently I was made aware of prisons in the South in particular that have opted to ban your book from prison libraries. So as freedom of speech, freedom of press, among other freedoms, comes under fire, how do we continue to get the message out there?
Well, that's something students can do something about. The book was banned in New Jersey prisons, and that ban was overturned. So it's been banned in a number of states, in the North as well as the South, and along with many, many other very valuable books. And I think the banning of my book and many others reflects the fact that the prison administration doesn't actually want people to have access to information about how and why they find themselves locked in cages in a nation that calls itself the land of the free. And our criminal injustice system long ago kind of gave up the pretense that it was interested in rehabilitation or education when Bill Clinton abandoned the Pell Grant program for the education of people inside prisons. That was a reflection of the fact that we as a nation completely gave up any pretense that we are interested in educating or rehabilitating those who are behind bars, and only sought to inflict harsher and harsher punishment and suffering upon them. So I would hope that all of us would commit ourselves to ensuring that people behind bars get access to books, get access to education. Students here at Princeton and elsewhere can be involved in providing education to folks who are locked up. Inside Out programs and others that can be brought inside prisons so that the education and knowledge you're receiving here isn't hoarded here, but is shared with people who would not otherwise have access to it. And so the banning of books is just a small symptom of a much larger phenomenon of our nation turning its back on, rehabilitation and education of those who have been locked up and locked out.
Can we get? No. Okay. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Matthew.
Can you speak up?
My name is Matthew. I'm going to be an AAS major, not yet declared, but will. My question is 2 parts. One, you said that the party system we have here is a 2-party system that's pay to play. And I've read Black Power by Toure and Hamilton, and they have this idea that whites act as a monolith when it comes to like our political parties. And so in this like pluralist system that we have, my question is how do you get white people more generally and just people interested in going against what could be in their own material gain? So these kind of like institutional and policy structures that work for their advantage but disadvantage people of color, and say, how do you get those people to want to be on the side of justice rather than their own personal and group gain? And 2, in kind of this country's administration and rooms like this where you hear this like clapping, but it seems like there's a hypocrisy between American ideals and what is actually being played out on the political sphere. and that for a lot of people of color, this doesn't necessarily seem like a surprise, but rather kind of what happens. How do you not contain this like major sense of futility in your actions and not get frustrated by like these clapping rooms that kind of seem a little bit, yeah, futile? How do you maintain a radical sense of hope?
You know, over the years, I've had the opportunity to work with and be in partnership with people who have somehow survived the most unimaginable horrors in prison, on the outside, and who still get up in the morning and continue the struggle. And it's not just inspiring in kind of a superficial way. It reminds me that there is a meaning and purpose to all of our lives beyond just getting our immediate wishes and desires met. I think about our ancestors, what they lived and struggled and died for and somehow survived. And I think about people who haven't made it, who have been crushed by the system. And I realize, what really is the point of my life or any of our lives if we are not willing to use the limited time that we have here on earth to work for justice, to try to spread some measure of compassion, or what I like to think of as revolutionary love, in the short time we're alive. So for me, it's not radical hope that one day America will be the place it's meant to be, but it's really a sort of an existential question. What is the point of my life? What's the point of my life, and how do I want to use the time that I'm here? And I think at some point we all have to just kind of face ourselves and look in the mirror and say, I don't know whether this fight can be won, but am I willing to be in the struggle anyway? Am I willing to be in the struggle for all those who came before me, all those who have suffered far more than I have and still wake up every day are in the struggle, and all those who haven't made it because the system has crushed them? And there was a time in my life when I used to get upset when I would read stuff like Derek Bell's book arguing, you know, there's the permanence of racism, and I would think, well, what's the point? What's the point of all of this? If racism is permanent in the United States, what's the point? And one could argue that if racism is permanent in the United States, well, that means we've got to work even harder. We've got to be even more committed, more devoted, because we know that there's going to be so much unnecessary suffering. I have hope in this sense, not that America can be saved, but I know no empire lasts forever. No empire lasts forever. And so what's next? And this nation can go out in a ball of fire because we stoke a nuclear war with North Korea. We could go out through civil war. We could go out in any number of really awful, horrifying ways. But American empire could also end because something new somehow pushes up through the concrete, that something new takes hold and is born as statues come down and movements are born, that something out of the ashes of slavery and Jim Crow and all this, something new is born. And I don't know that that will happen, but I'm willing to devote my life to trying to make it be so. And I guess that's radical hope. For me, it's become just a reason for living. And for my kids, for grandkids if I ever have them, we don't have to know how the story will turn out or to feel overly confident that it will go our way, whatever we think that means. I think we just have to stay committed and have faith that there is a purpose to our lives beyond ourselves.
And with that, I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight. Michelle Alexander.